Alright, hello y'all. So I am going to discuss my topic with y'all. I'm just going to go over a few little cases or significant cases over the LGBTQ plus community and how they've been affected from the beginning and all the way till they transition to present day, and how depending on these cases, how it's affected them and within the Constitution and how they've just evolved as a whole. So let me just start off by saying how oftentimes people are faced with struggles of being discriminated, whether that be in your religion, where your economic background comes from, or even who you are. But with this particular community, they often face discrimination because of their sexual orientation. Now, when we look at our Constitution, we see how it has the fundamental principles for our government, which protects our basic rights, which falls under the Bill of Rights. And to start off with that, we have the 10 Amendments, as you all know, which guarantees essential rights and civil liberties such as the right to free speech and the right to a fair trial, as well as reserving rights to the people and the states. So this is what defines the first 10 Amendments and how come the LGBTQ plus community has been struggling for so long. But even though this particular topic is not addressed directly in the Constitution, there is a remarkable shift over the next couple of decades that shaped the community into what we know as today. So let me start off with one of the most significant first actual Supreme Court cases that began the transition for this community. And it deals with the freedom of speech, religion, press, all within the First Amendment essentially is what this applies for. And we see this in the 1 Inc. v. Olson in 1958 case, which basically talks about the First Amendment. In this particular case, it started in 1953 when a publisher in Los Angeles, which was one of the country's first homophile groups at the time, which released something unique for its first time. It was a magazine called One, the homosexual magazine. This article became known as America's first widely distributed magazine for gay readers. And so basically this was brought up to the Supreme Court's attention because not long after it was published, the Los Angeles postal authorities seized the August and October editions, unfortunately. And the reasons that they established for these needs of seizing those 2 months worth of editions was due to the fact that these publications violated obscenity laws. But in conclusion, the Supreme Court had ruled that directing publications towards a gay audience was not fundamentally obscene. This basically meant that the people had the right to publish for the LGBTQ media, and this was a mark of a drastic shift in the right direction for this community in the future. Sorry. Following this case, we have the Stonewall riot, as all y'all know from all y'all's history classes you probably took since you've been here. It took place on June 28th, 1969 in New York. Stonewall was a gay bar that was raided by the police. The gay community was agitated due to the men and women being arrested. Therefore, this led to a full-blown riot. Eventually, due to the Stonewall riot of 1969, we see in the following years that gay organizations begin to form. And in 1970, we began to see a rise of gay pride parades. Following this is in the first time in 1972, we have the Supreme Court that took into account the issue of gay marriage or just marriage equality in general. This case is about a Minneapolis gay couple that wanted to get married. So Baker, one of the spouses, ended up going to law school so he could find a way to legally get married. Unfortunately, this particular case did not rule in the LGBTQ community's favor because the court dismissed the case for one of substantial federal question. The next major case that we're going to talk about in the history of the LGBTQ community was the case of Bowers v. Hardwick, which took place in 1986. It was basically a 5-4 ruling stating that the 14th Amendment's promise of due process doesn't prevent states from criminalizing private consensual sex between people of the same sex. And to add on to that, Karen Lowy, a senior counsel who fights for LGBTQ rights, said that the court labeled LGBTQ people as criminals in every sense. Employers would fire people and say, well, it has nothing to do with who you are. It has to do with the fact that you're a criminal. And this is the first time where we see how they're basically not, how can I say this? There's a shift in the LGBTQ community, but how we can see how they are criminalized, but no one saw anything wrong with that. With the Constitution that established our fundamental rights, there is definitely a lack of necessary rights for these particular Americans due to their sexuality. one can see how in the Constitution we have the 14th Amendment, which establishes our Equal Protection Clause. And at this time, this is the first movement we see an amendment being brought up in a court case known as Romer v. Evans of 1996. And according to Cornell law, we even see how equal protection forces a state to govern impartially, not draw distinctions between individuals solely on differences that are irrelevant to a legitimate governmental objective. Thus, the Equal Protection Clause is crucial to the protection of civil rights. So, during this case, the Supreme Court essentially ruled out that no laws could not single out the LGBTQ people. Basically, during this court case, it revolved around an amendment to a Colorado law. This law decided to ban cities from passing anti-discrimination laws that would protect gay and bisexual people. Overall, in a 6-3 decision, the court realized that this violated the Equal Protection Clause due to the fact that it singled out a particular group. The senior counsel mentioned above before, who dedicates her practices to this particular community, did not only take the Bowers v. Hardy case, but also took this LGBTQ case 10 years later. And Lowy just explains how in the Romer case, the Supreme Court finally recognized for the first time that carving LGBTQ people out of protections that everyone else would have access to violated equal protections. While we see all these Supreme Court cases being brought up, we can see that LGBTQ community is slowly being acknowledged, that the Constitution does even apply to them. Even if it's not directly applied to them, it still applies within the context of it. Another case that ties in with the violation of one's amendments would be the Boy Scouts of America v. Dale of 1996. This court case took place the same year that the courts established that laws could not single out this particular community. Essentially, this case applies to an organization and whether or not the rule applies to them when singling out particular members for affiliating themselves within this LGBTQ community. So basically, Dale, a Boy Scouts leader who was affiliated to a lesbian/gay alliance, was expelled from being a Scoutmaster due to his identification. But the overall decision became in favor with Boy Scouts of America because the courts concluded that forcing the Scouts to readmit Dale would violate their First Amendment of right of freedom of association. So this court case took place in 1996, and it wasn't until 2013, such a big difference, like later on, when the Boy Scouts of America decided to end its ban on gay people as members, even though the ban ended for children and it still continued to apply for gay adult leaders. Next we have the case of United States v. Windsor 2013, more modern in today's context. And this case is about a gay couple that was married in New York, and when the spouse passed away, Windsor tried to claim tax exemption, but unfortunately it was blocked by DOMA. But the Supreme Court eventually ruled out that DOMA violated due process and equal protection principles and ordered the United States to refund Windsor's taxes. So we can see from the first significant court case that I mentioned, dating from 1953 all the way to 2013, we can see how court cases have revolutionized the rights for the LGBTQ community as a whole, and how it's a fundamental stepping stone into the right direction, and how they are slowly getting accepted in today's society. But we can still see in society today, there is still a fight for this equality for this particular community. In 2015, we have the case Obergefell v. Hodges, and this appears to be known as one of the LGBTQ rights movement's biggest victory for marriage. This was essentially a 5-4 vote in which the Supreme Court said state officials were violating the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause by prohibiting them from marrying or not recognizing marriages performed in other states. So this major court case decision was what the LGBTQ community needed in order to make such a cultural impact to close the barriers between straight people. Even though the barrier for marriage between straight and non-straight people are closed, there are still issues today that people often face. These issues would come in context with our most current issues being that we see the idea of trans rights and their rights for gender-neutral bathrooms. And this most relevant case was dealing with a bathroom equality issue known as Doe v. Boyertown case. For this case, it deals with a high school in Pennsylvania that allows locker rooms, showers, and restrooms to open to the opposite sex. Many people said it violated bodily privacy rights, but in reality, the Supreme Court sided with the school district in allowing to support transgender students. So from the court cases I mentioned from 1953 all the way to 2015 dealing with trans right issues, even though the Constitution doesn't directly address this towards the LGBTQ community, in context with the first 10 amendments, we do see how even though it wasn't fought for in the beginning with this community, when you look at the underlying meaning of all of this, you can see how it does apply to the LGBTQ community. So with the evolution of the LGBTQ community, there is a sense of growth over the course of time dating back to the Constitution. And when the Constitution was established, none of it was directly established, as I was saying, to this particular community. But the 10 amendments and all this was directed to everyone as a whole. We all have equality. So this was such a fight for the LGBTQ community. And honestly, if y'all just take a moment, look back to the past, to the present, you'll see how the evolution of not only the community, but the evolution of the constitutionality of it all has made a remarkable shift and a remarkable impact on today's culture. Thank you.